Okay, so I'm here to talk about the work of Simon Stålenhag, because that is how you say it. And this is Stålenhag's Home on the Web, the title for his art gallery on the World Wide Web, which has been running since about 2012, 2013. And when you click that image, instead of like going to a home page, it goes to a similarly scuffed old school map, a map which turns out to be a map of the west of Stockholm, the archipelagos out there, Munso, Adelsö and Svartsjölandet. And underneath that, this vast 25-kilometre wide loop, this particle accelerator in concentric rings surrounding a reactor with three cooling towers, which is known in English as the loop. And so as we see, there's these outflux cables connecting it to a larger part of the world, as well as influxes as well, and all of this lies underneath, as well as extending beyond these islands in a sort of suburban to rural part of Sweden. And it's all presented as being from the 1980s. Down at the bottom there you have the date 1981 of this map, so it's like an imagined artifact from that period. And this is the setting for Stålenhag's art book, for want of a better word, Tales from the Loop, which was published in 2015, 2016, depending on whether you're thinking about the Swedish or the English edition. Now, the title of my talk comes from the epigram at the start of this book, which is from a poem by one Thomas Tranströmer, the Nobel laureate poet, very famous in Sweden. And the name of the poem is Open and Closed Spaces. And that idea of open and closed spaces is actually quite salient to what I'm going to be talking about today in Stålenhag's work. And in Tranströmer's poems, he looks at the sort of mundane and the quotidian, but also there's a sense of sort of optimism and longing, also a pastoralness to the way that he writes, and the suburban setting, and all of these tropes are kind of reflected in Stålenhag's work. But you will have noticed that in amongst all of this there are robots stalking the countryside. So the cosy suburban with light there reflecting the kind of warm closed space, and light is really important here, sits alongside the open space of the natural environment, the somewhat contained countryside, nonetheless very beautiful, just gently touched by human hands, and then there's robots striding through it, machines abandoned in the snow with the birds kind of emerging from it, having nested, all sitting alongside the more mundane snowscape, the roads, and the familiar environment. And Stålenhag works quite hard to sell us the reality of these constructions. So the floating ship there shares the kind of industrial design, the colours and the textures of the 1980s vehicles that he remembers. The whole conceit of this book is a sort of imagined childhood, an imagined memory of an 80s where these robots, vehicles and this vast particle accelerator existed. And on his website, when he shows these images, he also gives us close-ups. It's important to him, clearly, to focus on a couple of things. One is the textures, the qualities of the line. So he's keen to reveal, even though these are digital paintings, a kind of worked brushwork, a visible brushwork in constructing these shapes out of a kind of light, and the textures nested alongside the grasses and the trees, the forest, the cloud and so on. And he's also drawing attention to the interactions between the individuals, these little episodes, to use a term from Michael O'Toole, of interaction, of narrative that happen within these images. And these colours are kind of reflected throughout. The forest landscape is important, twilight light is important, and the people who inhabit these spaces are kind of always interacting in mundane or playful or teasing ways with these imagined creatures, vehicles and so on that pass through this beautiful landscape. And the qualities then of the artwork does kind of reflect a romantic tradition of the human dwarfed by nature that looms over it. Human constructions kind of embedded in the background of a pastoral landscape. This is Thomas Cole's The Arcadian or Pastoral State, with the looming mountains, the twilight light, the episodes of human interaction, and then the human construction lurking within this framing nature. That idea of the Arcadian brings me to a kind of structure and a way of thinking about Stollenhag's work that was mentioned in my abstract, and that's Samuel Delany writing about W.H. Auden, extracted in Jerry Canavan and Kim Stanley Robinson's collection Green Planets. So it's kind of this multiply nested quotation here. But what Delany draws from Auden is this four-part view of the world, four modernist worldviews. One of them is the New Jerusalem, which is the technological super city. Everything is bright and shiny and clean, and we're supposed to be impressed by the amazing application of science and the human construction there. The flip side of that is the Brave New World, where everything is too regimented. There is something sinister about it, and it effaces the human. And these are sort of two flip sides of the same coin. And Auden also looks at the rural counterpart to that, the Arcadia, where everything is natural, beautiful, humans live at one with nature, all foods are natural, and there's no machine larger than one person can fix in an hour. Arcadia is wonderful, but its flip side is the land of the flies, a world of earthquake, the threatening nature, decay, famine, disease and destruction. So these four images of construction of the natural environment with their light and dark sides help to kind of frame the way we might think about Stollenhag, who brings all of these things together. The looming towers then of the Bonner reactor often recur through Stollenhag's work. They're a motif that are always there in the background. Impressive, also identical, ominous and dwarfing the suburban landscape in the middle with the cosy closed spaces, and then nature lying underneath it and surrounding it. And the kids who sit in the foreground there have their spade, have their sledge, these very simple machines which are much more homely. So these multiple scales kind of recur through Stollenhag's work. We get the kind of mundane, remembered 1980s of familiar vehicles, which we've kind of absorbed into an almost Arcadian, in terms of its nostalgia, an almost Arcadian kind of memory of the world, but then the reactors in the background looming, changing over time, and framing it around the borders here is nature, the dandelions, the flowers, the leaves, the grasses and so on, with that beautifully worked brushwork. Even though it's digital, the mark of the brush is really important. Nor is this limited to a Swedish Arcadian pastoral landscape. Later on in Tales from the Loop, Stollenhag switches his attention to an American environment. Now, I haven't mentioned much the fact that these paintings in the book go alongside paragraphs describing the remembered interaction with this environment as from Stollenhag's youth, stories from his friends, stories of his parents, often very mundane, but then also kind of mentioning the amazing constructions and the science that's going on in the background. And in this image, we see a rather incongruous woolly-hatted figure emerging from this cabled sphere, and in a fairly rare image sequence, just an image pair here. In the previous image, we've seen that same person go into a sphere, and the accompanying story tells Secondhand, this lad's recount of him traveling through the spheres and going to Las Vegas and having a wild time there and meeting all the Americans and so on, and with the implausible social material in there, so you get a sense that the story is dismissed. But nonetheless, the implication is that the loop is not only connected underground and connected through outfluxes and influxes, but there are vast connections right across the Earth, and that these figures being repeated, these three towers being repeated on the other side of the globe, again suggest a connection to something much larger than we can perceive. And so this put me in mind of Timothy Morton's hyperobjects. So Morton, and I'm extracting his account of it here from Sublime Objects, defines hyperobjects as things that are massively distributed in time and space, too big for us to grasp at human scale. And what he's thinking of here is the climate, for example, something that is absolutely physical and concrete, but because it's so large on human terms, we tend to think of it as abstract because we cannot perceive it in the massive amount of time that it takes, and we cannot perceive it in the massive amount of space that it takes. It's way, way too big. It's scary, it's unknowable, and so the hyperobject is, by its nature, sublime. And that sense of the sublime, connected, large, persisting in time hyperobject recurs through Stollenhag's work. In this image from the American side of Tales from the Loop, we see this object obviously aged through time, left to rust. It has a history, and the cabling, as so often in these images, leads off the border of the page and implies something bigger that connects it. I would also draw attention to the road here. Not only is the road network itself a kind of hyperobject connecting a vast continent and maybe even multiple continents, but also we see the cracking and decay of the road, reminding us that it's persisted through time. The cabling of electricity wires, again, it's a familiar thing rather than the less familiar cabling that's shown elsewhere, leads off the edges in this image as well. And I'd also draw attention to the crisscrossing vapor trails that suggest lines of transit, which are also important in other elements of Stollenhag's work. And framing this again is nature, and we see the desertification or the reclamation of the landscape by the stubborn flowers that are kind of encroaching back on this space. So we get a sense that nature exists through time. It comes and goes. It has been here longer than us. And the machine then rust, decay, and crumble in the face of this. So this recalls that kind of reclamation of nature that has been referred to in some of the other panels in the day's proceedings. The eagle-eyed among you will have noticed that there was a dinosaur huddling in that object as well. And dinosaurs emerge later on in Tales from the Loop. This image, I think, captures a lot of what's going on for Stollenhag. The dinosaurs running around in the Swedish fields, the road kind of curving away, connected elsewhere, and these vast loops emerging from the mist in the background of this kind of autumnal, wintry pastoral scene, with cabling descending into the ground, the loops descending into the ground, and curves that cannot be contained by the borders. In the book, this is an impressive edge bleed double page spread, again emphasising the scale and emphasising a kind of contact with the individual holding the text. Stollenhag later was recruited to paint dinosaurs with his wonderful command of light and his interest in selling us the reality of these creatures by the convincing and carefully touched brushwork of what's going on in the background, the handling of light in the waves there, for example, the light on the mountains, again reflecting this kind of romantic view of landscape completely untouched by humans in the past here. And so when he imports those back into his Swedish modern landscapes, with cabling leading off, with the forests, trees, the woodland in the background, and these abandoned, repeated hulks of vehicles sitting in the foreground, then we get this sense of connection across time and across space. And in among these things then are the kids who are just throwing snowballs or exploring, and for whom all of this stuff is mundane. The connection of children to these landscapes, to these strange objects, and to these stories is our connection into this world. The stories, like I say, are narrated in first person from Stollenhag's imagined memories, like a memoir of the 1980s, and he describes what his mates did in this environment. And sometimes things get a little sinister. The story that goes with this individual cuddling that cat is that all of the cats from the neighbourhood started going missing, and they couldn't figure out where it was until eventually they came across this lad's den and lair with a whole load of corpses of gutted cats, kind of prepared and filleted because he's feeding his dragons. He's got this collection of dinosaurs there to whom he's feeding the neighbourhood cats. Ew. So the children are our viewpoint characters, as it were. We rarely see their faces. Mostly it's the backs of heads, and they are set against these vast objects disappearing into the background, looming beyond them, and the smallness of the children then emphasises the scale and the age of the objects that are in the background. Also, looking through the child's eyes, we get a sense of this sort of wonder and fascination that children have for any machinery, and in a way that both kind of emphasises our own wonder and fascination looking at these science fictional objects, but also it kind of reminds us that our mundane objects are also wonderful and fascinating. At one point during the book, Stollenhag lets all of the image go away, and we just have white space bleeding right to the edge of the pages. My background is in comics scholarship and graphic narrative theory, and one of the things that I suggest happens in comics when we stop using panels or frames to enclose these images and allow them to open up to the edge of the page, this is a way of kind of making contact between the creator and the reader. That space, that flat plane of the page is a phatic space, a contact space. Jakobson's use of the word phatic as a function for language emphasises the maintenance of contact between human beings. Malinowski's use of the word phatic aims to describe those empty bits of talk that simply maintain human relationships. And so when nothing separates us from the figures that are depicted on the page, there's a sense of reaching out of these figures, a sense of them making immediate contact with us. And this is even more striking when at one point, quite unconnected to other images, in the middle of the text we get this image, which it took me a while to figure out what this was. It turns out that it's blood pudding, actually. This is a Swiss black pudding made of blood, and then that's jam spattered across the page. But of course it looks rather violent, it looks bloody, a little bit fearful. So familiar but unfamiliar, fear-inspiring perhaps. And the fork, if you look at the full-scale image on the page, is about human size, which is another way in which graphic narratives and these kinds of artist books might sell us the reality of things and kind of leap out into the world, just in the same way that a character reaching out of a panel might have them connect to our world. Now, Stollenhag does this a little bit more in his follow-up from Tales from the Loop called Things from the Flood. There's a sequence of rather disturbing images where he inverts that idea of machines appearing in nature and starts to present nature appearing in machines. So he shows us these mundane, familiar, late 80s, early 90s objects, and inside them kind of organic objects emerging, bloody and disturbing, kind of distending these objects and trying to break out. The conceit of Things from the Flood is that a portal has not only opened to the other side of the world, but also has opened to a far distant planet, Pegasi B, which is an ocean world in which there's alien bacteria and viruses, and they flood into the underground loop facility and start to infect everyday things. Also, in Things from the Flood, the looming towers in the background are places where human beings live, contained by this technology, in images reminiscent of J.G. Ballard's High Rise, perhaps. And finally, the robots that escape the facility into the countryside adopt both human clothes and also take things from nature itself, like these robots who've adopted feathers and plumage and are petting birds. Are they dead birds? It's hard to tell. One more thing that Things from the Flood does that isn't explored very much in Tales from the Loop is it does do some sequence. Again, I'm a comic scholar and a comics theorist, graphic narrative theorist, and mostly these things are not sequential art. I don't think that's essential to narrative, in fact, but there is a point here where Stollenhag does go for sequence. We follow these two lovers found here in an abandoned shell of a robot vehicle, and they run through the fields in a classic Stollenhag image, with these connected, cabled, repetitive, looming buildings in the background, and also that kind of land of the flies, powerful nature casting down its electricity in this storm that's raging around them. And they find an abandoned facility just to hang out in, which is operating as the panels move up and reveal circuitry inside, doing goodness knows what to whatever is cabled beneath it and what lies below. And there's a certain interest in that from the figures. But they have their own lives that they are interested in, so they turn away from the sign of this hyper object as it operates to and fro. And then ultimately, when they walk away, on the flip side of this image, they are not paying attention to this that is coming out of the flood that's deep underground, with a sort of bloodied, gruesome, looks like there's human figures in there, certainly animal figures that's being spat out. And again, this whole thing can be read as a metaphor for climate change, right? The fact that we're walking away from it, we can't perceive it, it's too big, we don't pay attention to it, it's too horrible, but it is going on and it's being destructive in the background. So Things from the Flood then inverts a lot of the images and ideas that are set up in Tales from the Loop, where instead of these machines and robots and science fiction objects that are found surrounded by nature, increasingly nature is contained, framed, as we see here, by those objects. We see a little bit more humans and a little bit more visual narrative here as well, but often they are still proceeding with their own lives, turning away from the objects around them, but rather unlike the children who are turning towards. And the last thing to fit in here then is the idea of transmediation. Now, with Tales from the Loop having this very open, unenclosed and metonymic approach to it, with these little paragraphs suggesting things that are happening outside the images that we see, so it lends beautifully to being a tabletop RPG. And so the Tales from the Loop RPG invites you to choose either the Swedish or the US loop in which to play, or even, bottom right here, make a loop in your own hometown. So sort of imagine it in your own childhood and in your recognised places. You're invited to play the kids here, who are kind of given faces and given problems and relationships and items. But it's interesting that the sort of skills and items and the things that identify the character and characters are mundane. You know, these guys don't have superpowers, they're just kids in the 1980s. And also some of this scuffed, found item design that you find in Tales from the Loop is repeated exactly in the RPG and sort of presented as, well, this really is how magnetron flight works within the world. So the stuff that was coined, created for the original publication, is repurposed beautifully in the role-playing game. the way it expects you to structure your adventures in this world, interestingly revolve around seasons and the changing environment, the changing background, and the cycle of life for the kids, with mad science going on there. And there's an alternative, a more freeform approach, which is to think about landscape and the mystery landscapes, so these objects and places that lie around in a map that you devise or that you borrow from Stollenhag. Those are the places for adventure, the places to be fascinated in, the mysteries to uncover and discover. It's less about fighting and winning in someone and more about finding out. There's a fascination enacted here. And so to sum up, you have the machines suggesting, with their kind of patterning suggesting a larger connection to bigger things. So these two huge magnetrine ships in the background are on a shipping lane which extends way beyond here. In the foreground we have the mundane, remembered 1980s and the old cathode ray monitor that's held by this individual. And in the middle level, the suburban, the cosy, the enclosed spaces with this familiar, safe, warm light, and then surrounding that, nature. Inside those spaces then we have cabling and connectedness. The early days of the internet are hinted at here, with people in there involved, trying to do things in these spaces, fascinated, their faces often hidden, and these nostalgic items suggesting a sort of attitude towards the futuristic material that's here, projecting kind of backwards this sort of imagined technological future into a memory wherein that stuff then becomes mundane and outdated, so that Stollenhag is messing with time here. And so within this huge winter landscape, these loops that have persisted through time, that extend beyond the space of the page, that loom fast above us, and also have this history whereby they must connect somewhere deeper, be cabled somewhere deeper, have emerged from somewhere, be part of something else that might have been built, all extends this idea of a hyperobject extending in both space and time, as well as bringing together the New Jerusalem with its brave new world aspects to it, and the Arcadian pastoral, but also with this sense of the decay that brings about. And that leads us to a final image, a sort of et in Arcadia ego image, where the ego, the I that is in Arcadia, is death itself. And so images of death also haunt the corners and towards the end of Tales from the Loop, as well as things from the flood. And nature often actually is what survives, as here, this abandoned, decaying robot with its sort of skull that implies death is surrounded and overtaken by nature that persists beyond it. Thank you.
Wow.